A woman can survive a loveless marriage, the old Duchess once whispered to Evelyn Whitmore beneath the trembling candlelight of Blackthorn Cathedral. But she will never survive becoming invisible inside it. Snow fell heavily across the towering stained-glass windows as Evelyn stood alone at the altar, her ivory gloves clenched so tightly that the delicate lace threatened to tear beneath her fingers. The cathedral smelled of cold stone, melted wax, and winter roses, yet none of it could soften the silence surrounding the Duke of Blackthorn. Sebastian Valecrest stood beside her like a carved shadow, tall and immovable in black formal attire that made his pale gray eyes appear almost silver beneath the dim golden chandeliers. He did not look at her when the vows were spoken. He did not hesitate either. His voice remained calm, deep, perfectly controlled as he promised duty, loyalty, and protection before God and the crown. But not once did warmth enter his expression. Not once did his gloved fingers tighten around hers. The guests noticed it. Evelyn knew they did. She could feel the whispers drifting through the cathedral pews like winter smoke. Poor girl. The Duke looks as though he's attending a funeral. Perhaps he already regrets it. Evelyn lowered her gaze before pity could settle fully upon her face. She had known exactly what this marriage would be long before she stepped into the cathedral. Blackthorn needed stability after years of scandal and isolation. Her father needed salvation from financial ruin. And Sebastian Valecrest needed a duchess he could marry without loving. The agreement had been painfully simple. The carriage ride to Blackthorn Hall stretched nearly 4 hours through snow-covered roads and barren forests swallowed by dusk. Inside the carriage, silence wrapped itself around them thicker than the velvet blankets resting across Evelyn's lap. She sat with perfect posture despite the exhaustion weighing beneath her ribs, her fingers folded tightly as candlelight flickered against the frosted windows. Across from her, Sebastian stared outside into the storm without acknowledging her once. His sharp profile remained unreadable beneath the passing shadows. At last, just as the distant silhouette of Blackthorn Hall emerged through the snowfall, like a dark kingdom rising from the earth, he finally spoke. "You will find every comfort you require at Blackthorn," he said evenly. "The staff has been instructed to treat you with the respect due your position." Evelyn nodded softly. "Thank you, Your Grace." His jaw tightened slightly at her formal tone, though he himself had created the distance between them from the beginning. "There will be expectations from society," he continued. "Public appearances, dinners, charity events. We will fulfill our responsibilities properly." Responsibilities. The word lingered heavily between them. Evelyn turned her eyes toward the icy glass window before answering. "Of course." Another silence followed. Then came the sentence that would remain inside her chest for years afterward, like a frozen blade. "I do not believe affection is necessary for a successful marriage," Sebastian said quietly. The carriage wheels groaned beneath the snow-covered road. Somewhere outside, the wind howled against the black iron lanterns fixed to the carriage doors. Evelyn felt her heartbeat slow instead of break. Strange, she thought. Pain should have felt sharper than this. But perhaps disappointment only truly wounded those who had once allowed themselves hope. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice calm despite the cold spreading through her chest. "Then you need not fear disappointment from me, Your Grace." For the first time that evening, Sebastian looked directly at her. Candlelight flickered across Evelyn's pale features, illuminating the quiet dignity in her eyes and the painful absence of accusation within them. Most women would have pleaded for tenderness. Others would have shown hurt. But Evelyn Whitmore simply accepted the loneliness he offered her as though she had expected nothing else from life. And somehow, that unsettled him far more than tears ever could. Blackthorn Hall was beautiful in the same way winter was beautiful. Grand, silent, untouchable. Each morning, pale lights spilled through the towering windows and stretched across endless marble corridors where footsteps echoed like whispers trapped inside stone. Evelyn quickly learned the rhythm of the estate. The servants rose before dawn. Breakfast was served precisely at 8 o'clock. The Duke departed for his study at 9 and rarely emerged before evening. Everything inside Blackthorn moved with cold perfection, as though warmth itself had long ago been forbidden from entering its walls. Yet despite the silence surrounding her marriage, Evelyn performed every duty expected of a duchess with graceful precision. She memorized the names of nearly 40 household staff members within the first week. She restored order to the neglected West Wing accounts. She listened patiently to tenant concerns during village meetings while snow gathered quietly outside the chapel windows. The older servants soon began watching her with something close to cautious affection. Not because she demanded loyalty, but because she never demanded anything at all. Her Grace thanked the kitchen maids personally yesterday. One servant whispered in astonishment near the servants' staircase. No Duchess has done that in years. She smiles even when she is alone, another murmured softly. That is usually a sad sign. Evelyn heard more than they realized. But she simply continued walking through the corridors with calm dignity, her pale blue gowns trailing softly across polished floors while candlelight flickered against the ancient portraits lining the walls. Sebastian noticed the changes too, though he refused to dwell upon them. At first, he viewed her efficiency as merely convenient. The estate ran more smoothly. Dinner guests spoke favorably of the new Duchess of Blackthorn. His household no longer resembled a mausoleum abandoned by the living. Yet what unsettled him was not her competence. It was her absence of complaint. Evelyn never questioned why he spent evenings alone in his study instead of beside her at dinner. She never asked why separate fires burned in separate bedrooms each night. She never attempted forced affection or meaningless conversation. In truth, she behaved exactly as he had requested. And somehow, that disturbed him more with each passing day. One evening in late January, Sebastian entered the dining hall nearly an hour later than expected after a difficult meeting regarding northern trade routes. Snow clung to the shoulders of his dark wool coat as he removed his gloves near the entrance. He fully expected to find the dining table cleared and the room empty. Instead, Evelyn still sat quietly near the candlelit end of the long oak table, a closed book resting gently in her lap. She looked up as he entered, clearly surprised. "I was informed you would not be dining tonight," she said softly. Sebastian glanced toward the untouched second plate waiting across from her. The food had long since cooled. "You waited?" he asked before he could stop himself. Evelyn lowered her eyes almost immediately. It seemed proper. Proper. Always that careful distance. Always those measured words spoken like delicate threads placed between them. Sebastian removed his coat slowly, studying her without understanding why a strange pressure had settled beneath his ribs. Most women in her position would have grown resentful by now. Others would have attempted to manipulate his attention through tears or anger. But Evelyn Whitmore simply endured the emptiness of Blackthorn Hall with quiet grace, as though loneliness were something she had already made peace with long before arriving there. During dinner, candle flames danced softly between them, while silver utensils clinked faintly against porcelain. Evelyn asked about the snowstorms affecting northern villages. Sebastian answered briefly. Then silence returned once more. Yet tonight it felt different somehow. He became painfully aware of the small details he had once ignored entirely. The faint exhaustion shadowing beneath her eyes. The way her fingers tightened slightly around her teacup whenever cold wind rattled the windows. The softness of her voice whenever she thanked the servants. And for the first time in years, Sebastian found himself lingering at the dinner table long after the meal had ended simply because the silence no longer felt entirely empty. By February, the storms surrounding Blackthorn Hall had grown fiercer, swallowing the cliffs and forests beneath endless sheets of white. At night, the wind rattled the ancient windows hard enough to sound like restless spirits clawing against the glass. Yet inside the great estate, another kind of silence lingered far more dangerously. Sebastian Vailcrest had spent years convincing himself that solitude was peace. It was easier that way. Easier than remembering the woman who had once stood beneath summer lanterns promising him forever before abandoning him for a title even greater than his own. Lady Helena Ashbourne had been beautiful in the cruelest possible way. Golden-haired, elegant, worshipped by London society. Sebastian had once believed she loved him with the same intensity he loved her. Until the morning he discovered her engagement announcement printed across every newspaper in England beside the name of a foreign prince. No explanation. No farewell worth remembering. Only humiliation wrapped in polished headlines and whispered sympathy from people who secretly enjoyed watching powerful men bleed quietly. After that, Sebastian stopped believing in affection entirely. Love made fools of men. Marriage, at least, could be controlled, structured, predictable. That belief had followed him into every corner of Blackthorn Hall long before Evelyn Whitmore ever crossed its threshold. Yet lately, his carefully ordered world had begun shifting in ways he could neither explain nor prevent. It started with small things, unwelcome things. One afternoon, Sebastian entered the library unexpectedly and found Evelyn asleep near the fire with an open book resting against her lap. Pale winter sunlight touched the soft curve of her cheek, while flames flickered gold through strands of chestnut hair that had loosened from their pins. She looked exhausted, not dramatic, not fragile, simply tired in the quiet way people became tired when they carried loneliness too long without complaint. Sebastian should have left immediately. Instead, he stood there watching her for several moments longer than necessary. There was something deeply unsettling about the peace in her sleeping face. No bitterness, no resentment. Only a sadness so carefully hidden it became visible only when she forgot the world was. Looking at her, the floorboard beneath his boot creaked softly. Evelyn stirred awake almost instantly, blinking in confusion before rising quickly from the armchair. "I apologize," she said, smoothing her skirts with embarrassment warming her cheeks. "I did not intend to fall asleep here." Sebastian closed the library door behind him. "You do not need my permission to rest inside your own home." The words surprised both of them. Evelyn lowered her gaze. "Thank you." Again, that calm distance. That unbearable gentleness untouched by accusation. Sebastian moved toward the fireplace slowly, removing his gloves while shadows from the flames danced across the dark walls lined with books. "Mrs. Ashford mentioned you have reorganized the household accounts," he said quietly. "The estate expenses were unnecessarily excessive in certain areas," Evelyn replied. "I thought perhaps the funds could better serve the tenant villages during the remainder of winter." Sebastian glanced at her then. Most noblewomen cared more about ballroom invitations than struggling villages buried beneath snowstorms. Yet Evelyn spoke about the tenants with genuine concern, as though their hardships mattered personally to her. "You have changed much within this house already," he admitted reluctantly. Evelyn looked startled by the statement. For one brief second, something almost hopeful flickered across her expression before disappearing entirely. "I am only fulfilling my responsibilities," she answered softly. Responsibilities. The same cold word he himself had once used inside the carriage on their wedding night. Hearing it spoken in her voice unsettled him far more now. Silence settled between them once again, though tonight it carried a strange tension neither fully understood. Sebastian found himself studying the delicate exhaustion beneath her eyes. The quiet grace in the way she folded her hands. The way she never fully met his gaze for more than a moment before looking away again. And suddenly he realized something deeply uncomfortable. He could not remember the last time Evelyn Whitmore had looked at him with expectation. Whatever fragile hope she may once have carried into Blackthorn Hall had already begun fading into silence. And for reasons he could not explain, the thought left an unfamiliar ache spreading slowly through his chest, like winter frost creeping across stone. The first grand gathering of the winter season arrived beneath a sky heavy with silver clouds and falling snow. By sunset, dozens of carriages lined the curved entrance of Blackthorn Hall, while golden lanterns flickered against the icy darkness beyond the estate gates. Inside, the ballroom glowed with candlelight reflected through towering mirrors framed in gold leaf and dark walnut. Music drifted softly through the hall as noblemen and ladies moved gracefully across polished marble floors, their laughter echoing beneath crystal chandeliers like delicate bells. Evelyn stood near the edge of the ballroom in a gown the color of midnight blue, the silk catching candlelight each time she turned slightly toward another guest. Tiny pearls rested at her throat like drops of winter frost against pale skin. She looked every bit the Duchess of Blackthorn. Elegant, composed, untouchably graceful. Yet Sebastian noticed almost immediately that something about her smile felt distant tonight. Not sad, simply tired. He had spent most of the evening enduring tedious conversations regarding trade negotiations and political alliances, while nobles subtly observed the distance between himself and his wife. He was accustomed to scrutiny. Powerful men always were. What he had not expected was the irritation slowly tightening beneath his skin each time another guest approached Evelyn with thinly veiled curiosity. "Your Duchess seems remarkably quiet," Lady Beaumont remarked with a knowing smile while adjusting the lace sleeve of her silver gown. Though perhaps that is understandable. Blackthorn Hall does have a reputation for being rather cold. Sebastian's expression hardened slightly. My wife appears perfectly comfortable. Lady Beaumont laughed softly behind her fan. Of course. Still, one wonders whether beauty alone is enough to warm a marriage built on obligation. The comment should not have affected him. Society thrived upon gossip. It always had. Yet something dark stirred unpleasantly in his chest as his eyes drifted across the ballroom toward Evelyn standing alone beside the grand staircase. She was smiling politely at an elderly countess while several younger women whispered nearby. Sebastian caught fragments of their conversation as he passed. Poor thing barely sees her husband. I heard the Duke still keeps separate chambers. Perhaps she finally realizes affection will never come. Evelyn heard them too. Sebastian knew she did because her fingers tightened briefly around the stem of her champagne glass before relaxing again almost immediately. No anger. No embarrassment. Only that same unbearable composure she wore like armor. She simply inclined her head politely toward the women and moved away without protest. For reasons Sebastian could not explain, watching her retreat quietly through the crowd filled him with sudden fury. Before he fully realized his own intentions, he crossed the ballroom toward the group of whispering ladies. Conversations nearby softened instantly at the sight of the Duke approaching. Lady Beaumont, Sebastian said evenly, though his voice carried enough steel to silence the surrounding guests. I would advise caution before mistaking my wife's grace for weakness. The woman's smile faltered. Your Grace, I meant no offense. Then perhaps you should speak less carelessly in my home. Silence spread across the ballroom like a ripple beneath frozen water. Several guests lowered their eyes at once. Others exchanged startled glances behind jeweled fans. Sebastian rarely defended anyone publicly, especially not with visible irritation darkening his expression. Across the room, Evelyn had stopped walking. She turned slowly toward him, clearly stunned by what she had just witnessed. Their eyes met through the sea of candlelight and moving dancers. For one brief moment, something fragile flickered across her face again. Not hope exactly. Something quieter. More dangerous. Sebastian suddenly became aware of how close he stood to her now. Close enough to notice the faint tremble in her breath. Close enough to catch the delicate scent of winter roses lingering against her skin. You did not need to involve yourself, Evelyn said softly once the music resumed around them. Sebastian held her gaze longer than usual. You are the Duchess of Blackthorn, he replied quietly. No one insults you while standing beneath my roof. The words should have sounded cold, protective only in the formal sense. Yet something inside them felt different tonight. Evelyn seemed to hear it too because her expression softened almost imperceptibly before she lowered her eyes once again. And when she finally stepped away into the moving crowd, Sebastian realized with growing unease that watching her disappear had become the most unsettling part of his evening. After the winter ball, something subtle began changing inside Blackthorn Hall. Not enough for outsiders to notice immediately, but enough for the servants to exchange quiet glances whenever the Duke entered a room already occupied by his wife. Sebastian himself refused to name the shift taking root beneath his carefully controlled composure. He only knew that his attention had begun seeking Evelyn without permission. He noticed when she skipped breakfast after long nights reviewing estate records beside candlelight. He noticed the soft exhaustion lingering beneath her eyes during village meetings. He noticed the way her shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly whenever guests mentioned love or marriage within her hearing. Worst of all, he noticed when she smiled. Because Evelyn smiled rarely now, and when she did, it transformed something inside the cold halls of Blackthorn into warmth he had forgotten existed. One snowy afternoon in early March, several neighboring nobles arrived unexpectedly at the estate to escape worsening weather conditions on the northern roads. Blackthorn Hall quickly filled with unfamiliar voices, wet coats, and the scent of burning cedarwood drifting through crowded corridors. Among the guests was Lord Adrian Fairfield, a young widowed count with an easy smile and a reputation for excessive charm. Unlike most noblemen, Adrian possessed the dangerous habit of paying genuine attention when women spoke. During dinner that evening, Sebastian sat at the head of the long dining table listening absently to Political discussions while candlelight flickered against crystal glasses and silver platters. Across from him, Evelyn sat beside Lord Fairfield near the center of the table. At first, Sebastian paid little attention to their conversation. Then he heard her laugh. Soft, brief, real. The sound struck him with startling force. Sebastian's eyes lifted immediately toward her. Evelyn had turned slightly toward Adrian, her expression warmer than he had seen in weeks. The Count was speaking about some absurd disaster involving a runaway horse during a spring festival years ago, and Evelyn covered her smile lightly behind her fingertips while listening. It was a small moment. Innocent. Meaningless perhaps. Yet something unpleasant twisted sharply beneath Sebastian's ribs. Adrian leaned closer. You have a beautiful laugh, Your Grace, he said warmly. Blackthorn Hall should hear it more often. Evelyn lowered her gaze politely. You are kind to say so. Sebastian's grip tightened slowly around the stem of his wine glass. The conversation around him faded into distant noise. He became painfully aware of every detail unfolding several feet away. The way Adrian looked at her directly instead of through her. The ease in Evelyn's posture for the first time in months. The faint color warming her cheeks beneath candlelight. Sebastian disliked it immediately. No, not disliked. Hated. The realization unsettled him enough to darken his mood for the remainder of the evening. Later that night, snowstorm winds roared violently outside the estate, while Sebastian stood alone beside the fireplace in his study, staring into flames that offered no comfort. He could not explain why the image of Evelyn smiling at another man continued replaying through his mind with unbearable persistence. It should not matter. Their marriage had never been built upon affection. He himself had drawn that boundary clearly from the beginning. And yet tonight, the thought of another man becoming the reason for her smile filled him with something dangerously close to anger. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter, he called sharply. The door opened slowly. Evelyn stepped inside, carrying several estate documents against her chest. Her pale blue robe caught the firelight softly while loose strands of chestnut hair framed her tired features. I apologize for disturbing you, she said gently. These required your signature before morning. Sebastian crossed the room toward her before she could set the papers down. He stopped closer than usual, close enough to notice the faint scent of lavender lingering against her skin. Evelyn seemed startled by the shortened distance between them. Did you enjoy dinner? He asked suddenly. She blinked softly at the unexpected question. Yes. His jaw tightened slightly. Lord Fairfield appears determined to entertain you. Evelyn hesitated before answering carefully. He was simply being polite. Sebastian studied her face far longer than necessary. Then, quietly, almost coldly, he said, You seemed happier speaking with him than you do with me. Silence fell heavily between them. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the papers she carried while confusion flickered across her expression. Perhaps even disbelief. Because for the first time since entering Blackthorn Hall, the Duke sounded almost as though her happiness mattered to him. After that night in his study, Sebastian began noticing how often Evelyn looked tired. Not the ordinary exhaustion of long winter days or endless social obligations, but a deeper weariness she tried carefully to conceal beneath graceful smiles and quiet manners. Once he became aware of it, he could no longer ignore it. He noticed how her fingers occasionally trembled after long meetings with estate accountants. He noticed the pale shadows beneath her eyes during breakfast. Most unsettling of all, he noticed how frequently she dismissed her own discomfort with soft reassurances meant to ease everyone except herself. One evening near the end of March, freezing rain battered the tall windows of Blackthorn Hall, while thunder rolled heavily across the distant cliffs. Dinner had ended hours earlier, yet Evelyn had still not appeared downstairs afterward as she normally did to review final household matters with the staff. Sebastian remained in his study, attempting to focus on correspondence spread across his desk, but the scratching sound of his pen had grown increasingly uneven. At last he set the pen aside sharply. Where is the Duchess? He asked the butler when the older man entered carrying fresh firewood. Mr. Ashford hesitated almost imperceptibly. Her Grace requested tea be brought to her chambers earlier this evening. She mentioned a headache. Sebastian frowned slightly. Evelyn never complained of illness. Did the physician visit? No, Your Grace. The answer irritated him more than it should have. Before fully considering his own intentions, Sebastian rose from the desk and crossed the dim corridor toward the eastern wing, where Evelyn's private chambers overlooked the snow-covered gardens. Candle flames flickered weakly against dark walls as thunder shook the distant windows. When he reached her door, he paused briefly before knocking once. No answer came. His jaw tightened. Slowly, he opened the door. The room beyond glowed softly beneath firelight and scattered candles. Evelyn sat asleep beside the window wrapped in a pale cream shawl, one hand resting loosely against an open book that had slipped partly onto the carpet. Rain streaked the tall glass behind her while shadows danced gently across her delicate features. For one still moment, Sebastian simply watched her. She looked fragile tonight in a way that unsettled him deeply. Not weak, never weak, but worn thin by something invisible and persistent. He stepped farther into the room quietly. That was when he noticed the items resting on the nearby side table. Several untouched cups of cold tea, a bottle of sleeping tincture prescribed for anxiety, and beside them, neatly folded beneath candlelight, sat a small stack of letters tied carefully with pale ribbon. Sebastian recognized his own name written across the top envelope in Evelyn's elegant handwriting. None had ever been delivered. He should have looked away. Instead, his chest tightened painfully as he realized she had written to him many times without ever gathering the courage to send the letters at all. A soft cough suddenly broke the silence. Evelyn stirred weakly in the armchair, pressing trembling fingers briefly against her lips. Before noticing him standing there, her eyes widened immediately with embarrassment. "Your Grace," she whispered, trying to rise too quickly. The motion made her sway slightly. Sebastian crossed the room at once, steadying her gently by the arm before she could lose balance. The contact startled them both. Her skin felt cold beneath the thin fabric of her sleeve. "You are unwell," he said quietly. Evelyn lowered her eyes. "It is nothing serious. You should have called for the physician. I did not wish to trouble anyone." The answer struck him harder than expected. Not trouble anyone. As though she truly believed her suffering should remain invisible inside these walls. Sebastian's gaze drifted briefly toward the sleeping tincture and unopened letters still resting beside the firelight. Something dark and heavy settled inside his chest then. Guilt perhaps, or something dangerously close to regret. For months, Evelyn Whitmore had endured loneliness beneath his roof with enough grace to fool the entire world. Everyone except him now. Thunder echoed outside once more while candlelight flickered softly across her tired face. Sebastian realized suddenly that he could no longer remember the last evening he had spent without thinking about her. And the knowledge frightened him more than the storm beyond Blackthorn Hall ever could. Spring arrived slowly at Blackthorn Hall, though traces of winter still lingered along the cliffs and frozen gardens beyond the estate grounds. Pale sunlight now filtered through the towering windows during morning hours, softening the endless shadows that had once consumed the halls entirely. The servants noticed the change first. The Duke no longer spent every evening isolated inside his study. Some nights he appeared unexpectedly at dinner before the final course was served. Other evenings he walked beside the Duchess through the Western Gallery while discussing estate matters in low, measured voices. To outsiders, the marriage appeared to be improving naturally with time. Only Sebastian understood how unnatural the entire transformation truly felt. He had not intended to grow accustomed to Evelyn's presence. Yet now he found himself searching for her instinctively each morning. One afternoon, he entered the music room and paused at the sound of soft piano notes drifting through the open doorway. Evelyn sat alone beneath the sunlight wearing a pale lavender gown while her fingers moved gracefully across the ivory keys. The melody was quiet, melancholy, beautiful in the way lonely things often were. Sebastian remained standing near the doorway longer than necessary, listening silently while dust glimmered through the golden light surrounding her like falling ash. Evelyn finally noticed him only after the final note faded into silence. She looked startled. "I did not realize anyone was here." Sebastian stepped farther into the room. "You play well." A faint smile touched her lips politely. "My mother insisted music was essential for young ladies." Again that careful politeness. That invisible distance she maintained even now while he stood only a few feet away. Yet lately, Sebastian had begun realizing something quietly devastating. Evelyn no longer waited for him. In the early months of their marriage, He often found her lingering near the library in the evenings, as though hoping he might eventually emerge from work to speak with her. She once waited during dinners, even when he arrived impossibly late. She once looked at him with soft expectation before quickly hiding it away. But now those small things had disappeared entirely. She no longer searched the doorway when footsteps echoed through the corridor. She no longer seemed disappointed when he missed breakfast or dinner. Somehow, her acceptance of his distance had become complete. And Sebastian hated it. Later that evening, Blackthorn hosted a small gathering for several neighboring families celebrating the end of winter storms. Candlelight filled the drawing room while guests laughed softly over glasses of wine beside roaring fireplaces. Sebastian stood speaking with a magistrate near the far wall when his attention shifted immediately toward Evelyn across the room. Lord Adrian Fairfield stood beside her once again. This time, Evelyn looked genuinely relaxed while listening to one of Adrian's stories. The Count's warm laughter blended easily with hers beneath the music drifting softly from nearby violins. Sebastian's jaw tightened almost instantly. He told himself the feeling was irrational, childish even. Yet he could not stop watching the way Adrian looked at her with open admiration instead of careful distance. The way Evelyn smiled more freely in those moments than she ever did with him. "Your Grace," the magistrate continued awkwardly after noticing Sebastian's distraction. "Shall we discuss the northern contracts further?" Sebastian barely heard him. Across the room, Adrian leaned slightly closer toward Evelyn and offered her a single white rose taken from a decorative arrangement nearby. Evelyn blinked in surprise before accepting it politely. The sight struck Sebastian with unreasonable force. He crossed the room before fully realizing his own intentions. Guests gradually fell silent as the Duke approached. Evelyn looked up first, startled by the sharpness in his expression. Sebastian's eyes moved briefly toward the white rose in her hand, then toward Adrian. "Lord Fairfield," he said evenly, though tension darkened every syllable. "I believe my wife promised me the next dance." Silence spread instantly through the drawing room. Adrian stepped back with graceful understanding. "Of course, Your Grace." Evelyn stared at Sebastian in visible surprise as he extended his hand toward her. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Because Sebastian Veilcrest had never once asked his wife to dance before. Slowly, Evelyn placed her hand in his. Her fingers felt delicate and cool against his palm as he guided her toward the center of the room beneath hundreds of flickering candles. The music began softly around them, while Sebastian's hand settled carefully at her waist. Too carefully, as though touching her suddenly mattered far too much. Evelyn's breath trembled faintly. "You did not need to rescue me," she whispered quietly. Sebastian looked down at her then, his gray eyes darker than candle smoke. "Perhaps," he replied softly, "but I am growing tired of watching other men make you smile, while I stand across the room pretending it does not affect me." For several days after the dance, an unfamiliar tension settled over Blackthorn Hall. Not unpleasant, not entirely, but fragile in the way spring ice becomes fragile beneath warming sunlight. Sebastian found himself seeking excuses to remain near Evelyn more often. He joined her during breakfast instead of eating alone inside his study. He accompanied her on short walks through the gardens while pale flowers slowly emerged from thawing earth. Some evenings, they even spoke quietly beside the library fire long after midnight, while rain tapped softly against the windows. To anyone watching from the outside, it might have resembled the beginning of something tender. But Evelyn had already learned how dangerous hope could become inside a lonely heart. She noticed the changes in him. Of course she did. Sebastian looked at her differently now. Longer. Softer. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression almost troubled, as though he himself did not understand what he was feeling. Yet despite those changes, he never truly spoke the words she once longed desperately to hear. He never called her beloved. Never touched her hand unless circumstance required it. Never admitted that she had become something more than duty inside his carefully guarded world. And slowly, painfully, Evelyn began understanding the truth. Sebastian cared for her perhaps, but caring was not the same as love. One rainy afternoon in April, several members of Parliament arrived unexpectedly at Blackthorn Hall to discuss regional trade disputes with the Duke. Evelyn remained absent from the formal gathering until dinner, choosing instead to oversee repairs at the village school damaged during winter storms. By the time she entered the dining hall that evening, exhaustion weighed heavily beneath her graceful composure. Her gown was damp near the hem from rain-soaked roads, and faint shadows darkened beneath her eyes once again. Sebastian noticed immediately. "You should have rested today," he said quietly as she took her seat beside him. Evelyn offered a small smile. The children required assistance. Before Sebastian could respond, Lord Pembroke, one of the visiting officials, laughed lightly from across the table. "Your Grace has become remarkably devoted to charity work," he remarked toward Evelyn. "Though perhaps it is easier to seek purpose elsewhere when one marries without affection." Silence fell instantly across the dining hall. Sebastian's expression hardened at once. But before he could speak, another guest added carelessly, "Surely practical marriages among nobility are rarely sentimental affairs." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the table. Evelyn lowered her gaze toward her untouched wine glass. Normally, Sebastian would have ended the conversation immediately. Instead, distracted by political frustrations and several glasses of whiskey consumed earlier during negotiations, he answered without fully considering the damage his words would cause. "Affection was never part of the arrangement," he said evenly. The sentence landed like shattered glass inside the silence. Sebastian realized his mistake almost immediately. Across the table, Evelyn went perfectly still. Not dramatic, not angry. Somehow that made it infinitely worse. Her fingers tightened faintly around the stem of her wine glass before relaxing once more. She lifted her eyes toward him slowly. And for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Hall, Sebastian saw something inside her finally break. Not loudly, not visibly to anyone else in the room. But he saw it. The last fragile hope she had hidden so carefully behind quiet smiles and graceful manners disappeared from her eyes completely. "Excuse me," Evelyn whispered softly. She rose from the table with perfect composure and left the dining hall beneath the flickering candlelight without another word. Sebastian stared after her, unease spreading coldly through his chest. Lord Pembroke shifted awkwardly. "I fear we may have upset her grace." Sebastian pushed back his chair abruptly. "You will continue dinner without me." By the time he reached the eastern corridor outside Evelyn's chambers, rain hammered violently against the windows while thunder echoed across the cliffs beyond Blackthorn Hall. He lifted his hand to knock, then paused. Through the partially open doorway, he saw Evelyn standing beside the fireplace holding one of the unsent letters she had once hidden carefully in her room. Slowly, with trembling calm, she placed the letter into the flames. Sebastian stood frozen in the dark corridor as fire consumed the paper inch by inch. He did not know what the letter had contained, but somehow he understood with terrifying certainty that whatever love Evelyn Whitmore had once carried for him was burning away with it. The days following the disastrous dinner became unbearably quiet inside Blackthorn Hall. Not the ordinary silence Sebastian had once preferred for years, but something colder now, emptier. The kind of silence that settled after something fragile had finally broken beyond repair. Evelyn remained perfectly polite. That was perhaps the cruelest part of all. She still joined him at breakfast when required, still attended estate meetings beside him with calm elegance, still smiled gently at servants and guests alike. Yet every softness once reserved quietly for Sebastian himself had vanished completely. She no longer lingered when conversations ended, no longer waited for him near the library fire at night. Even her gaze had changed. Once, her eyes carried hidden warmth whenever they rested on him too long. Now they reflected only graceful distance. And Sebastian could feel himself losing her more with every passing hour. One evening near the end of April, rain drifted softly against the windows while Sebastian worked restlessly inside his study. Several unsigned documents lay scattered across the desk untouched. His concentration had abandoned him days ago. At last, frustrated beyond reason, he rose and crossed toward the decanter resting beside the fireplace. That was when he noticed it. A folded paper partially hidden beneath several estate ledgers delivered earlier that morning from the household office. Sebastian frowned slightly before lifting it into the candlelight. The moment he recognized Evelyn's handwriting, unease tightened sharply through his chest. It was not a letter. It was a travel request addressed to the household steward. Temporary relocation arrangements for the Duchess of Blackthorn to the Whitmore countryside estate beginning in June. Sebastian read the lines. twice before understanding them fully. She was leaving, not dramatically, not angrily, simply quietly preparing to remove herself from Blackthorn Hall altogether. The realization struck him with terrifying force. Suddenly, the massive estate around him felt unbearably cold. He could almost hear the silence waiting inside every corridor after her departure. No soft music drifting from the piano room. No candlelight glowing beneath her chamber door late at night. No quiet voice thanking servants by name. Nothing. Sebastian set the paper down slowly, though his hands no longer felt steady. A memory surfaced without warning then. Evelyn asleep beside the library fire. Evelyn waiting alone at dinner while food turned cold. Evelyn burning her unsent letters one by one while thunder echoed outside the windows. God, how long had she been hurting this way while he stood blind beside her? A sharp knock interrupted the silence. "Enter," Sebastian called, though his voice sounded distant even to himself. Mr. Ashford stepped carefully into the study. "Your Grace, the carriage for Her Grace has been prepared for tomorrow morning." Sebastian turned sharply. "Carriage?" The butler hesitated. The Duchess requested transportation to Rosehaven Village. There was an accident involving the school roof after tonight's storm. Of course, Evelyn would still place others before herself even now. Sebastian closed his eyes briefly before reaching for his coat. "Have the horses saddled." "Your Grace." "I will accompany her." Rain poured heavily across the courtyard the following morning while servants hurried beneath umbrellas preparing the carriage. Evelyn stood near the entrance steps wrapped in a dark blue traveling cloak, surprise flickering visibly across her features when Sebastian emerged from the hall wearing black gloves and a long wool coat. "You do not need to come," she said softly above the rain. Sebastian descended the stone steps slowly until only a few feet separated them. "I know." Evelyn looked away almost immediately, and something inside him twisted painfully at the gesture. She always looked away now, as though loving him had become something she regretted too deeply to survive twice. During the long carriage ride through rain-soaked roads and gray countryside, silence settled heavily between them once again. But this silence felt different from the cold distance of their early marriage. This one carried grief. Sebastian watched raindrops slide across the window beside Evelyn while she stared quietly toward the blurred landscape outside. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to tell her that hearing another man make her laugh now felt unbearable to him. That Blackthorn Hall no longer resembled home unless she stood somewhere inside it. But the words remained trapped behind years of pride and fear. Then suddenly the carriage lurched violently over uneven ground. Evelyn lost balance slightly as thunder cracked overhead. Instinctively, Sebastian reached for her hand. Her fingers trembled faintly against his for one startled moment before she gently pulled away. The small movement shattered something inside him far more completely than anger ever could. Because Sebastian Veilcrest finally understood the terrible truth too late. Evelyn Whitmore was no longer waiting for him to choose her. May arrived with warmer winds sweeping across the cliffs surrounding Blackthorn Hall, yet the distance between Sebastian and Evelyn only continued growing colder. She still fulfilled every responsibility expected of the Duchess of Blackthorn with flawless grace. She attended charity functions, oversaw repairs throughout the northern villages, hosted visiting nobles with gentle elegance that left guests praising her endlessly once they departed the estate. But privately, she had already begun slipping away from him piece by piece. Sebastian felt it constantly now. In the mornings, she no longer lingered after breakfast ended. During evening walks through the gardens, her replies became shorter, softer, careful in a way that reminded him painfully of strangers observing proper etiquette rather than husband and wife sharing a life. Worst of all, she had stopped looking at him the way she once had. The warmth was gone entirely. One afternoon, Blackthorn Hall hosted the annual Spring Assembly, one of the largest social gatherings of the season. Nobles from across the county arrived in elegant carriages beneath clear blue skies, while musicians filled the grand ballroom with lively waltzes and laughter. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across polished marble floors, while servants carried silver trays through crowds dressed in silk and velvet. Sebastian should have been focused on political alliances and estate negotiations. Instead, his attention remained fixed almost entirely on Evelyn from the moment she entered the ballroom. She wore pale silver tonight, the color making her appear almost luminous beneath the candlelight. Her chestnut hair had been pinned elegantly away from her face, revealing the delicate line of her throat adorned only with a simple pearl necklace. Conversations softened noticeably as she crossed the room. Men watched her openly now. Sebastian noticed that too. Lord Adrian Fairfield approached her near the ballroom staircase with his usual easy charm, offering a polite bow before speaking quietly enough that only Evelyn could hear his words. To Sebastian's growing irritation, she smiled. Not the forced polite smile she offered most guests. A real one. Soft, gentle, alive. Something sharp twisted violently inside his chest. Throughout the evening, Sebastian attempted repeatedly to pull his focus elsewhere. Yet every glance across the ballroom found Evelyn again, dancing once with an elderly duke, laughing softly beside several ladies near the terrace doors, speaking with Adrian beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers while musicians played another slow waltz. Then came the moment that shattered the final restraint Sebastian still possessed. Adrian extended his hand toward Evelyn with quiet warmth. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" Evelyn hesitated briefly before placing her hand in his. Sebastian watched as Adrian guided her gracefully toward the center of the ballroom. The orchestra swelled around them, while couples moved elegantly beneath golden candlelight. Evelyn looked calm beside him, comfortable. And suddenly Sebastian realized with terrifying clarity that another man was becoming the source of the happiness he himself had starved her of for far too long. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Before reason could stop him, Sebastian crossed the ballroom directly toward them. Guests gradually slowed their conversations as the Duke of Blackthorn moved through the crowd with unmistakable intensity, darkening his expression. Adrian noticed him first. Evelyn turned seconds later, surprise flickering across her face as Sebastian stopped beside them without speaking. The music continued around them, though the atmosphere inside the ballroom had shifted completely. Sebastian looked only at Evelyn. "Dance with me," he said quietly. Not cold, not formal, almost desperate. Adrian stepped back at once. "Your Grace." But Evelyn remained still. "I am already dancing with Lord Fairfield." Her voice stayed soft, calm. That hurt even more somehow. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Then, in the dance, silence spread outward through the ballroom like ripples beneath dark water. Nearby couples slowed visibly. Several guests exchanged startled glances behind jeweled fans. Because powerful men did not lose composure publicly. Especially not Sebastian Veilcrest. Yet tonight jealousy had stripped away every layer of restraint he once hid behind. Evelyn searched his face carefully then, perhaps seeing for the first time the fear beneath his control. The fear of losing her completely. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. Sebastian drew her toward the center of the ballroom beneath hundreds of watching eyes, while the orchestra continued softly around them. His hand settled at her waist with trembling restraint. Too careful, too reverent. Evelyn's pulse fluttered visibly at the base of her throat. "You are causing quite a scandal tonight," she whispered quietly without looking at him. Sebastian held her gaze with painful intensity. "Let them talk." The words came low and rough, honest in a way he had never allowed himself to be before. Around them, the ballroom faded into blurred candlelight and distant music, while Sebastian realized one devastating truth far too late. He no longer feared love. He feared losing the woman standing in his arms. The music ended, but the tension surrounding Sebastian and Evelyn remained suspended beneath the chandeliers long after the final note faded away. Conversations resumed cautiously throughout the ballroom, though whispers followed them everywhere now. The Duke of Blackthorn had publicly interrupted another man's dance for his wife. Society would feast upon the scandal for weeks. Yet Sebastian no longer cared. For the first time in years, fear outweighed pride inside him. Fear of losing the woman standing only inches away, while somehow already feeling impossibly distant. Evelyn withdrew her hand slowly once the dance concluded. "You should return to your guests," she said softly. Her voice remained calm, but exhaustion lingered beneath every word. Sebastian looked at her carefully beneath the candlelight. "And you?" "I believe I have had enough of ballrooms for one evening." Before he could answer, Evelyn turned gracefully and walked toward the terrace doors overlooking the moonlit gardens. Sebastian followed almost immediately. Outside, Cool spring air drifted softly through the marble terrace while lanterns flickered against climbing ivy and pale stone columns. Music from the ballroom echoed faintly through the open doors behind them, distant now compared to the silence standing between them. Evelyn rested one hand lightly against the stone railing overlooking the dark gardens below. Moonlight silvered the loose strands of chestnut hair brushing softly against her cheek. Sebastian stopped several feet away at first, uncertain suddenly in a way he had never experienced before. He had negotiated political alliances with kings without hesitation, faced financial ruin, betrayal, public humiliation. Yet standing beside Evelyn now felt infinitely more terrifying. Because this mattered. She mattered. Evelyn. She closed her eyes briefly at the sound of her name spoken so gently by him. "Please do not," she whispered. Sebastian's chest tightened painfully. "Do not what?" She turned toward him slowly then, and the quiet sadness in her expression nearly destroyed him. "Do not begin caring for me now simply because another man noticed what you ignored." The words struck with devastating precision. Sebastian moved closer instinctively. "That is not what this is." "Then what is it?" Her composure cracked slightly for the first time in months. "Because I no longer understand you." Wind stirred softly around them, while distant thunder rolled far beyond the cliffs. Sebastian stared at her beneath the trembling lantern light, every carefully constructed wall inside him finally beginning to collapse. "I thought distance would protect us both," he admitted quietly. "I believed affection only made people weak, vulnerable." Evelyn's eyes glistened faintly though no tears fell. "And did it?" He swallowed hard. "No." Silence trembled between them. Sebastian stepped closer again until only inches separated them now. Close enough to hear her uneven breathing. Close enough to see the heartbreak she had hidden quietly for months behind graceful smiles and lowered eyes. "I was cruel without realizing it," he said roughly. "Every dinner I missed. Every moment I left you alone inside that house. God, Evelyn," his voice faltered slightly. "I did not understand what I was losing until you stopped looking at me the way you once did." Evelyn looked away immediately as though the confession itself hurt too much to survive. "You said affection was never part of our marriage." Sebastian's expression darkened with regret. "I was wrong." The words came instantly now. Honest. Unprotected. I was wrong about everything. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. The wind lifted the edge of Evelyn's silver gown while moonlight trembled softly across her pale face. Sebastian raised his hand carefully toward her, stopping just before touching her cheek as though afraid she might disappear entirely if he moved too quickly. "I cannot bear watching you drift farther from me," he whispered. "Not anymore." Evelyn's breath trembled unevenly. "You are too late." The quiet pain inside those 4 words shattered something deep within him. Sebastian closed his eyes briefly before finally letting his fingers brush softly against her cheek for the first time not out of duty, but reverence. "Perhaps," he admitted brokenly, "but I would still spend the rest of my life trying to reach you again if you allowed me the chance." Evelyn's tears finally escaped. Then, glimmering beneath the moonlight like shattered crystal against her skin. Yet even now, standing in his arms beneath the dark spring sky, Sebastian could feel how fragile she had become, how deeply he had wounded the woman he now loved too completely to lose. 3 days after the spring assembly, Evelyn Whitmore quietly finalized her departure from Blackthorn Hall. No dramatic announcement echoed through the estate. No tears. No accusations. That had never been her way. Instead, she spent the early morning hours reviewing final household records with the staff, ensuring every detail of the estate would continue smoothly after her absence. The servants noticed the difference in her immediately. She smiled less now, moved more slowly through the corridors once filled with soft music and quiet warmth. Even the flowers inside the western drawing room seemed forgotten beneath wilting petals and untouched water. By late afternoon, dark storm clouds gathered heavily above the cliffs surrounding Blackthorn. Rain lashed against the windows while distant thunder rolled across the sea like warning drums. Sebastian had spent nearly the entire day searching for Evelyn through the estate after discovering from Mrs. Ashford that her trunks had already been packed. Packed. The word hollowed something inside him each time he heard it. He finally found her inside the East Gallery just before dusk. Candlelight flickered weakly along the long corridor lined with ancient portraits, while rain hammered the towering windows overlooking the storm-dark gardens below. Evelyn stood near the far end of the gallery beside a small traveling case, resting quietly at her feet. She turned when she heard his footsteps approach, though her expression remained calm. Too calm. Sebastian stopped several feet away, breathing unevenly from both anger and fear. "You are leaving tonight." Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly. "Only for Rosehaven Manor. Do not lie to spare my feelings now." The sharpness in his voice echoed through the empty corridor before softening almost immediately into exhaustion. "You were not planning to return." Silence answered him. That silence frightened him more than anything else ever had. Sebastian crossed the remaining distance between them slowly. "Evelyn, look at me." She hesitated before lifting her gaze. God. Her eyes looked tired beyond words. Not angry. Simply wounded too deeply for anger to remain. "I cannot stay inside Blackthorn Hall pretending my heart still survives there," she whispered softly. The confession struck him like a blade. Sebastian swallowed hard. "You said I was too late." "You were." Rain crashed violently against the windows beside them, while thunder shook the old stone walls of the estate. Sebastian stared at her through the flickering candlelight, every ounce of pride finally collapsing beneath desperation. "Then let me spend the rest of my life proving I should not have been." Evelyn's expression trembled faintly. "You do not understand what it cost me to stop loving you." His chest tightened painfully. "No," he admitted roughly. "I understand now." For one terrible moment, neither of them moved. Then Evelyn reached for the handle of her traveling case quietly. Instinct overtook him completely. Sebastian stepped forward and caught her hand before she could turn away. The contact shook them both. "Please," he whispered. The words sounded unfamiliar in his voice. Raw. Human. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Sebastian, but he could already see it. The final goodbye waiting silently behind her expression. Panic surged through him harder than reason. Harder than dignity. Slowly, beneath the trembling candlelight and roaring storm beyond the windows, Sebastian Veilcrest sank to his knees before her. Evelyn stared down at him in shock, tears instantly rising to her eyes. Dukes did not kneel. Not for anyone. Yet there he was, one gloved hand still wrapped gently around hers while rain and thunder swallowed the silence around them. His voice broke when he finally spoke again. "Stay." Evelyn's breath trembled unevenly. Sebastian lowered his head briefly against her hand. His composure shattered completely now. "Stay even if you never forgive me. Stay even if it takes years for you to believe me." His gray eyes lifted toward hers again, filled with the kind of helpless devotion he had once feared. "More than death itself. But do not leave me alone inside that house after teaching me what it feels like to finally come alive again." Tears slipped silently down Evelyn's cheeks as the storm raged outside Blackthorn Hall. For the first time since their marriage began, Sebastian was no longer speaking like a duke protecting his pride. He was simply a man terrified of losing the only woman he had ever truly loved. Summer arrived gently at Blackthorn Hall. The violent storms of winter had long disappeared from the cliffs, replaced now by warm sunlight spilling through open windows and gardens overflowing with white roses beneath clear blue skies. Yet the greatest change inside the estate had nothing to do with seasons. It lived in the quiet spaces between Sebastian and Evelyn now. In the weeks following the night he knelt before her in the East Gallery, nothing transformed magically overnight. Sebastian did not expect forgiveness to erase months of loneliness and heartbreak. He understood at last that love was not proven through grand declarations alone, but through small consistencies repeated patiently every day. So he began there. He joined Evelyn for breakfast every morning without fail, even when estate matters demanded his attention elsewhere. He accompanied her personally during visits to the village school and listened while she spoke about repairs, children, and gardens with a softness he once ignored entirely. At night, he no longer disappeared into his study until dawn. Instead, he remained beside her in the library where candlelight flickered warmly across old books while rain or crickets whispered beyond the open windows. Slowly, the silence between them stopped hurting. One evening in late July, Evelyn stood alone in the western gardens gathering roses for the drawing room while golden sunset light spilled across the estate grounds. Her pale cream dress moved softly in the summer breeze as she trimmed several white blooms carefully between her fingers. Sebastian watched her quietly from the stone pathway for several moments before approaching. There was still reverence in the way he looked at her now, as though he could not fully believe she had chosen to remain beside him after all the ways he had failed her. Evelyn glanced up when she heard his footsteps. "You are finished with meetings already?" she asked softly. Sebastian nodded once. "I canceled the final one." A faint smile touched her lips. The Duke of Blackthorn neglecting responsibilities? Society may collapse entirely. He stepped closer, taking the rose carefully from her hand before answering. "I spent too many years worshipping responsibility while neglecting the only person who made my life worth returning to." Evelyn's breath caught faintly at the quiet honesty in his voice. Even now, months later, his tenderness still surprised her sometimes. Not because it felt false, because it felt real. And real things had once frightened her far more than loneliness ever had. Sebastian reached slowly for her hand. This time, she did not pull away. Warm evening light wrapped softly around them, while distant waves crashed gently against the cliffs below Blackthorn Hall. "I found something in my study yesterday," he said quietly. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. Sebastian removed several folded pages from inside his coat pocket. Her eyes widened instantly in recognition. The unsent letters. The ones she thought had burned completely months ago. "One survived the fire," Sebastian admitted softly. "Only partially." Evelyn looked down quickly, embarrassed emotion warming her cheeks. "You should not have read it." "I am grateful that I did." His thumb brushed gently across her knuckles. "You wrote that loving me felt like standing outside a locked room, praying someone inside might eventually hear you knocking." Pain flickered briefly through Evelyn's expression. Sebastian stepped closer immediately. "I heard you too late," he whispered. "But I swear to you, Evelyn, I hear you now." Tears shimmered softly in her eyes again, though this time they carried something lighter than heartbreak. Something healing. Sebastian lifted her hand carefully to his lips, pressing a slow kiss against her fingers beneath the fading summer light. No performance, no obligation, only devotion. And for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Hall, Evelyn no longer felt invisible beside him. Later that evening, the servants watched quietly as the Duke and Duchess crossed the grand hall together beneath glowing chandeliers and warm candlelight. Sebastian's hand rested gently against Evelyn's back while she smiled up at him with soft affection no longer shadowed by sadness. Blackthorn Hall itself seemed different somehow. Warmer. Alive again. Because love had finally entered the place where silence once ruled everything. And Sebastian Veilcrest understood now what pride had nearly cost him forever. Some hearts only learn how to love after they break at the feet of the person who deserved tenderness from the very beginning.